morning. Thank you very much for coming. Welcome to all of you, especially those of you who are outside of the architecture school. I see some faces from outside the real world, as I might say. So thank you for coming. I'm Jenny Rowe. In case you don't know me, I direct the Centre for Design and Health. And it's my pleasure to introduce Sarah Williams Goldhagen this evening. So Sarah brings to the school a really rich mixed disciplinary background that cuts across all four disciplines in our school. She's an architectural historian. She completed her PhD at Columbia in architectural history. She's taught architectural theory at Harvard Graduate Design School for 10 years. She was architectural critic for the New Republic and has also published extensively, including now a new book, Welcome to Your World, and the focus of today's lecture. So we all here in this room, I think, understand that design and planning matters. But we don't know all the ways that it matters or how it changes our internal and social experiences. So these experiences are at the heart of Sarah's new book. And what she's done here is draw on her own understanding of space, her acute observations about human behavior and nature in context. And she's combined that and synthesized it with theory and evidence from EP, from environmental psychology. And the fusion is really this powerful narrative about who we are, how we interact with each other, how we interact with our environment, and how that experience is central to not just us individually, but collectively, to what I call our civic health, that collective consciousness of a city. So the question is, how do we as designers harness that power to create a more equitable and just world? So welcome to your world. Sit back and discover how that world impacts on your mind and body. And please let's welcome Sarah to our world with a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome. I'm delighted to be here. I'm having such a good time. So, and I'm really excited about giving this talk. It's a talk that I've been working on and working on, and so you'll tell me how the new iteration is. You'll see that the title of the talk is a little different from the title of my book. The title of my book is How the Built Environment Shapes Our Lives. Here it's the mind, the body, and the built environment. And the reason for that is that's actually what I wanted the subtitle of the book to be. And the publisher said, well, they're a little too academic, but that's really what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the relationship of the mind to the body, something that people talk about a lot, and the relationship of the mind/body to the built environment, to the environment, but most specifically to the built environment. So that's what we're going to be examining today. Now, as we all know, notions about how best to design the built environment, I don't need to tell you this, urban design, architecture, landscape architecture, they change all the time, right? Ideologies, various things come in the way, infrastructure too. And there are basically three different reasons, three different factors that flow into these changes. One is new circumstances on the ground, new phenomena, globalization, hyper-urbanization, contemporary topics, new circumstances on the ground, climate change, sustainability, resilience, that kind of thing. New changing socio-political realities in this country. I will not say any more about that. New technologies is a big one, particularly in architecture. I mean, we now have lots and lots of discussion about glulam and the sorts of ways that new technologies in wood can be used to create new different kinds of forms. Obviously, digital technologies have had a big impact on formal explorations in architecture. And then there's one last one, which is new streams of information. And that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. Some of those new streams of information are theoretical. Post-structuralism, postmodernism had a big impact on on architectural theory, and then on architecture form making, and so on. I'm going to be talking about a different kind of information stream that I think is sort of in our world, our collective world, maybe a little less familiar. Am I doing okay?
You're doing fine, we just can't hear you at the back.
Okay. How's that, better? Yes. Yeah? Okay. So the newer streams of information that I've become interested in, as Jenny said, I started as a historian, concerns people's biological and physiological, really, responses to their surrounding environments. This has had some impact on mainstream academic pedagogy and psychology, and especially environmental psychology, and much less so, really, in schools of architecture. So on your right is an illustration of a very famous study in the 1970s that sort of kicked off or jump-started environmental psychology, which was kind of an emerging field at the time, by someone named Roger Ulrich, in which he, many of you, some of you will know this study. He basically took a set of patients that were all recovering from the same surgery, controlled for smoking and weight and health, general health, and so on and so forth. And they had their surgeries, and then they went into this corridor, and some patients went into rooms on that side of the corridor, and some patients went into rooms on the other side of the corridor. And as it happens, the rooms on one side of the corridor faced a brick wall, and the rooms on the other side of the corridor looked out on a pastoral landscape. And he studied them. And he studied two things. He studied requests for pain medication and speed of recovery and discharge from the hospital. And what he found was absolutely astonishing. 30% fewer requests for pain medication while the hospital patients were there, and they were released a full day earlier. Okay, just because of that. Looking out at a pastoral view versus looking at a brick wall. Okay, so these findings are already affecting healthcare architecture, and I'm certainly not here to claim that this is a beautiful space, but it is an emergency room, which is kind of extraordinary on Vancouver Island, a NIMEO emergency room. And basically, the architects took this information that people heal better and do better when they have some access to nature. This was shot right after it was finished. There's now like little trees and grass and things like that growing inside. These are where the patients go. So you sit in your emergency room bed and you look out onto nature across the hall. Not ideal, but think of the last time you were in the ER. You probably appreciate the attempt, if nothing else. So from this landmark study in the 1970s, people began to study other aspects of people's responses to nature and the natural environment. This is, on your left, a healing garden at the Arizona Cancer Center by 10 Ike Architects, and on your right, a healing garden in Chicago Children's Hospital by Mik-Young Kim. What they found is that when patients in hospitals had access to healing gardens, either left or right, they can look like in a lot of different ways, their cortisol levels decrease. They begin to decrease very, very rapidly. Their heart rates begin to decrease after 20 seconds of being in such a space, before the patients themselves even know that they're beginning to feel more relaxed. After 3 to 5 minutes, the patients begin to realize that they're feeling more relaxed. So the effects of nature, okay, and nature is an environment, correct? On people's experience, on their internal experience, on their sense of well-being, on their physiology, is really, really quite profound. So this, to step back a moment, what we're talking about here really is kind of the mind-body connection. You know, you see nature, and the things that you think and the things that you experience have an impact physiologically on you. But it's not just the mind-body connection, it's also the mind-body environment connection. And there are all sorts of questions to ask. Environmental psychologists continue to unpack the implications of these kinds of studies. Biophilic studies, questions in public health. So, you go back to that Ulrich window, okay? And so what is it about that made such a big impact on these people? Is it just that when you're in a hospital room, pretty grim, right? At least you're seeing something familiar. Is it just the familiarity of it? What about if you took evergreens and put them out there instead of deciduous trees? How would that change things? How would it change things if instead of outside that window you were looking at a desert landscape, which is much less green and green in a very different kind of way? Maybe it's just the natural light. Because we know that natural light, for example, on mental health has a profound impact on the way people feel. If it's natural light, can you take artificial light and simulate the circumstances of natural light in places like this where you can't give people access to a window? I'm just trying to give you a sense of all the different dimensions that go under that one original study that people are trying to unpack and tease out and study. What about, some people have proposed that it's not so much trees that we like, it's that trees have fractal geometries in them. So maybe it's the underlying geometries that you see in certain elements in nature and that you're appealed to. Well, that's really interesting because that's something that designers can really do something with, right? Maybe it's the horizon line. Or maybe it's none of those things, and it's just the fact that a landscape like that will change. So as opposed to a pretty unchanging environment in here, you have day, you have night, you have winter, you have summer, all these different things, okay? So there's a lot to learn. There continues to be a ton to learn, and all of this will help us design and design better. So this work in environmental psychology primarily, as I've said, has changed some elements of design practice already, but its underlying implications are even more profound. Because these studies suggest, as I began to say, that people are really fundamentally and profoundly enmeshed in their environments. And of course, most of us live not in nature, but in the built environment, and that's where we spend most of our time. And those environments, our built environments, affect us physiologically and psychologically in much more profound ways than people have really recognized. So we're talking not just about a mind-body connection, but as I said, about a mind-body environment connection. And as we begin to get a more detailed, fine-grained understanding of this, we can see how this information can be transferred onto built environments. So step back. If a view from a window can help your mother recover from surgery more quickly, what other aspects of design, fractals, horizon lines, colors, et cetera, are also shaping and affecting our experience, or our father's experience, our mother's experience? We know a little bit, of course, about how built environments shape social experience, and I'll talk about that. What about individual experience? What about our emotions? What about what we think? What about how we think? What about how we act? Well, we have information on these questions. It's not just kind of personalistic, it differs from person to person. We actually are getting information on all this, and it's really very cool. As you can see, I think it's incredibly cool. We're getting information not only from environmental psychology, but from other information streams, going back to the information streams that change design practices. So environmental psychology is certainly one, and then there's sort of an umbrella field that I'm calling studies in cognition, which includes cognitive neuroscience, cognitive linguistics, evolutionary psychology, all sorts of different ones, different things that are allowing us, but particularly the studies in cognition, we know a lot more about human perception and cognition than we did even 10, 20 years ago. And this is, I put this up because it's just a very simple, clean example. This is from an article of a husband-wife team who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology in 2014 for identifying what they call grid cells, which are the cells in the brain that we use to navigate spatially. And what they discovered, which had been hypothesized before, is that we don't navigate spatially through like rivers of movement, okay, or through geometries and discerning geometries. What we do is we take our body in space and we triangulate. So we're here and we go, oh, okay, that's there, so that's how I can move next. So we basically, imaginally, our brains are laying out a grid of triangles and triangles embedded into hexagons, and that's how we move and navigate through space. Now, interestingly enough, this works well with the human visual system because humans basically have pretty terrible vision, and our focal point vision is quite small, the radius of it, and our peripheral vision is not that great, and it gets worse and worse and worse out to the edges. So by triangulating, basically we're using, that's sort of the edge of where you can see in your peripheral vision, even when you're scanning around. And okay, so the reason I like this is because you can manifest it into design really quickly, which is that this is what Frank Lloyd Wright was doing in designing buildings like the Hannah House, in which the plan is taken from hexagons and triangles. And he talked about how I'm always looking at space from the corner of my eye. So he's basically intuiting something that now cognitive neuroscience has nailed down as actually the way that we navigate through spaces. Okay. So what studies in cognition are telling us is that the way we understand human perception and experience of our environments is very different from the canonical model, or what I call the folk model of cognition. In the folk model of cognition, which we all sort of shift back and forth between these models in everyday discussions, at least I certainly do. A fancier term with this would be the Cartesian model. The old model is the human body has sensory portals, right? And you feel temperature on your fingertips and weight on your toes, and you hear and you see and so on and so forth. And those sensations are then turned into perceptions, which are interpreted first by imaginations and then by feelings. And then you use your memory of other such experiences, imagination, feelings, and you begin to come to an interpretation, and then everything goes up, and you logically come to a cognition. Okay? And there are lots of examples of how we use this model, even though, as I will describe, it's wrong. For example, we tend to think of emotions as underneath reason, right? Reason's down there, emotions are up here. There's all sorts of ways in which this still dominates the way people think about how we experience our environments. The last 20 years, it's clear. People experience their environments in a way that's far more complex and far more interesting. There are basically 4 different dimensions to cognition and perception. I'm just going to list them, and then I'll explain. Non-conscious. Most of what we think is not conscious. Cognitive linguists estimate it's about 95% not conscious. Non-logical, associative. I'll give you lots of examples of that. multisensory, so it's not like you're taking from this sensory portal and that sensory portal and then your mind does this great synthesis. Not at all. The way that we apprehend our environments is multisensory. I'll explain. And multimodal, which simply means not only through your sensory portals, but also through your motor system, through decisions about acting. Okay, let's go into this a little more. Non-conscious. I told this story at my book party because it was one of the early studies that kind of got me into this stuff. I was reading like Psychology Today or some pop psychology magazine, and a study was published, it was discussed, and then I went and looked it up. It's by a professor at Yale, in which they got people who worked in human resources departments, and they handed out clipboards with resumes to 30 people, let's say. And what they didn't tell these people is that 15 of them had clipboards that were like really light and flimsy, and 15 of them had clipboards that were like super heavy. And then they asked them to assess the suitability of the candidates based on their resumes. And guess what? The people with the heavy clipboards assessed the candidates to be more intellectually substantive and better candidates than the people holding the lighter clipboards. Phew. Right? Blows your mind. That's pretty scary, among other things. Okay, but there it is. You have an environmental cue influencing what psychologists will call social cognition in ways that you're not aware of at all. Even if you ask those people, they wouldn't know that the clipboard had influenced their choice of candidates, okay? So cognition is non-conscious. It's non-logical. Now, for skeptics, I always pull out behavioral economics and say, well, you know, behavioral economics has shown that the way we think is pretty irrational a lot of the times, right? Well, so why would we think that the way we experience environments is more rational than the way that we make economic decisions? It's not. There are people who have studied, have taken sets of students, and I don't remember the exact way they set up the design the experiment, but basically they put some students in a room that had really low ceilings, some students in a room, and they were sort of similar students overall, that had really high ceilings, and they had them take tests of creativity. Guess what? High ceilings scored higher on creativity. Low ceilings, less high. Same thing. They did another study, high ceilings, but they painted the ceilings blue, like a sky blue. So white, sky blue, higher on creativity in the blue rooms. Because you have a sense of openness. It's associative. You're associating yourself with a kind of sense of liberation. That's not logical, okay? But it affects cognitive performance in a really profound way. More. So non-conscious, non-logical. One of my favorite non-logical examples was a study that was done, I think, in Michigan, in which they built a 10 by 10 by 10 foot box, and they put a desk inside of it, and they put people inside, and they said, take this test. So they took this test, and then they came back 2 weeks later, and they were confronted with the same box, and they said, sit outside of the box and take this test. And basically, the people who were outside the box scored higher on creativity and associative thinking than the people who were sitting inside the box. Okay, so like, what does this all add up to? It's kind of fun, but what does it mean? What it means is this: there is a pattern to the way our non-logical perceptions work. And that pattern is based in the fact of our embodiment, okay? So clipboard, we know that something's heavy is more substantive. We know that heavy rock stays still. and or more, they harder to move, right? We know that light things fly away. We know this because we live in bodies among objects in the world. And we create what psychologists call schemas about these things that we then transfer into other realms of knowledge and information. So there's a sense of liberation in ceilings, in rooms that have very high ceilings, in rooms that look out onto the sky. Think of James Turrell. It's like, wow. Okay? And there's a sense of constraint in a room that is quite enclosed. How we think, what we think, but also how we think is structured by the very fact of our phenomenological embodiment. We live in bodies, we face forward, things behind us, we don't know where they are, they're a little bit threatening. Okay, everybody knows what this means and what that means, and it's a cross-cultural kind of symbol. Good is up, down is bad. Important is big, little is small. She felt little, right? Embodied cognition. We think profoundly through the fact that we live in bodies on the ground. Okay, so non-conscious, non-logical or associative, and embodied. Multisensory. I'm shifting sort of to a different category of things. We all were taught, I assume, that we have 5 sensory portals, and we get our information through that. There are a lot more senses than 5. There's senses like proprioception, our sense of our body in space, interoception, our sense of the interior of our body, so on and so forth. And what cognitive scientists have found is that our senses work collaboratively from the start. So here is, I'm sorry, 2 not that great slides of the interior of Amiens Cathedral. And it's a wonderful example of designed multisensorily that advances the larger thematics of a structure. Okay, now what does that mean? I'll explain. Amiens is huge for people who have been there. Any Gothic cathedral, enormous, right? You go in, wow, you're just astonished. Amiens is particularly effective because Amiens, the city, was bombed during World War II. All the stained glass was destroyed, and they replaced it with clear glass. So you just have daylight streaming in to this space. It's really quite a wonderful place. Okay, so that's vision, right? That's vision and spatial sequence and moving through space. But there are auditory properties to these French Gothic cathedrals that also buttress the way you're supposed to feel in them, and that's that. Humans use sound not only for speaking, but also, as we know, for what's called echolocation. I hear someone up there leaving the room, and I know it's back up there. You hear sounds, and you immediately sort of locate where they are in space around you, right? That's a very important part of sound, is that it works with spatial navigation systems. What happens in these Gothic cathedrals is you walk in, and because of the faceted surfaces and the way that they're spaced and so on and so forth, is that echolocation doesn't work. And so you hear sounds, but you have no idea where they're coming from. And so you have this sense, it's a kind of a sense of uncanniness, like we're all here together, but I don't quite know where I am, but I see other people, but I'm hearing things, I don't know where they are. It gives you some kind of a sense of being in an other kind of space, an otherworldly kind of space. Okay, so multisensory, spatial navigation and sound, for example. Another example of multisensory, and one that I'll talk more about, is and this is incredibly cool, at least I think it's incredibly cool, which is that the neurons that we use, that our visual system uses to see, work with the neurons that we use to touch. Okay, so when you look at a surface like that, you're not only seeing it, but you're actually imagining what it feels like to touch it. And the difference between that touch and that touch. And you're imagining what this kind of soft surface, it's actually concrete, this is Utsen-Bagberg Church, what those things touch like. And touch is an incredibly complicated sense. It's, you know, you think of touch, but what are you doing when you touch? You're sensing temperature, you're sensing pliability, you're sensing the density of the material, you're sensing the surface of the material. So this, that our tactile neurons fire when we look is an incredibly powerful piece of information about how people experience their environments. Okay, so what can we conclude from some of this? Multimodal. So that's multisensory. As I said, soundscapes and echolocation and spatial navigation. Multimodal. Multimodal comes off of what I was just talking about, which is that, remember that Cartesian model, the folk model of cognition, where you had sensations and then you had perceptions above that and so on and so forth? The phrase I love is a phrase by a cognitive neuroscientist. Perception is perception for action. You are never not thinking about how you're going to act on things when you're perceiving them. Your motor neurons are always involved. Multimodal means you're using not only sensory neurons, you're also using your motor neuron system. And so this is a playground of environments like this just create what I call sticky spaces. You imagine jumping on those balls. You don't have to go and jump on them in order to get a set of associations that, that give you those feelings. You imagine what this texture is like. You imagine lying in that satellite dish, and so on and so forth, just by looking and walking around. What this means, if we step back even further, so non-conscious, non-logical and associative based on our embodiment, multisensory and multimodal. What this means is that the built environment, the environments we inhabit, is, if you think of, we're being bombarded with sensory information all the time, right? Is that everything is potentially what psychologists call a prime. A prime is a piece of sensory information, a stimulation that you're not aware of, but that influences what you do, how you think, and how you feel. So we have to reconceptualize the built environment as an ocean of primes. And that, I think, gives designers a very different way of thinking about what they're doing. I said to a friend of mine who was an architect, it's all about attention management. Anyway, we'll end. So primes affect decisions like what candidate you're going to hire, affect behavior like whether you're going to walk into Amiens or walk out. They affect our emotions, how we feel. Do we feel uplifted and transported? Do we feel diminished, et cetera, et cetera? And it's almost all, in the case of the built environment, it's almost all non-conscious. Cognition is largely non-conscious anyway, but in the built environment, I think even more so, because we don't really think about the built environment having this kind of agency over our thoughts and feelings and decisions. You know, no matter how tuned in we are to design and to architecture and cities and streetscapes and so on, we think of it all as kind of stage sets, and we're making the decision whether we're going to go talk to that person, or we're making the decision about whether we feel cold and want to put on a coat, and so on and so forth. It's a lot more complicated. Okay. So what all of this leads up to in these studies in cognition is that people are far more profoundly enmeshed in their environments than we realized. And we, most of the people sitting in this room, already know that environments are important, right? I don't need to convince you of that. And that their design is what matters. These are two views from the before and after view of the Central Business District of downtown Melbourne, which was reconfigured by Jan Gehl Associates, in which they had a Central Business District where people took off at 5 o'clock every afternoon, never went there on the weekends. It was full of these back alleyways. It was a graveyard most of the time, except when people went into their offices and worked. Gehl comes in and he does a bunch of studies, and he thinks, okay, well, if we take these back alleyways, can people hear me in the back? Okay, if we take these back alleyways and we just change the scale of them and give people options of places to stop and so on, and maybe repave them so that they know that they're in a place rather than in a passageway, maybe that'll bring people in. This has been called again and again, and not just by Gehl, the Melbourne miracle. The Central Business District of downtown Melbourne was completely and utterly transformed by these, by just these tiny little interventions and encouraging shopkeepers to go in and sell cheese and trinkets and whatever and so on. I was just there about a month and a half ago, and it was packed, absolutely packed with people. So part of what I'm saying is this, is that we need to reconceptualize how we think about design in the built environment, and need to really think deeply about what it means to have a habitat. Humans live in habitats. I read a book recently which made a huge impression on me. It's an older book called Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. And the dominant question of the book, he's a geographer, was how is it that advanced civilization happened in Europe and not in Africa? And he basically went through all the factors and identified the geographic factors that clearly went into the uneven development across the globe. He basically said that Europe had animals that were domesticable for beasts of burden. Africa didn't. Africa has those big game, right? It had an availability of raw materials to make tools and guns that Africa didn't. It had a variety of plant species and diversity, and some of those plant species were cultivable so that you could make crops and feed people out of them. So that's one, beast of burden, plant species diversity, raw materials, and the fourth factor was geographic proximity to other cultures for two reasons. One is knowledge transfer, right? So you borrow ideas. You say, oh, they've invented that. I'll take money, so we can do that too. That's one thing. But the second is also immunity to diseases, okay? So just by living in one kind of habitat versus another kind of habitat, people developed dramatically differently. Now, if that's true about the years from 10,000 BC to 300 AD, which is what Jared Diamond was writing about, of course it's true now. We're in habitats, and the habitats profoundly affect what we do and who we are. Not only that, And you could say, okay, so raw design, right? It matters, it's important. We'll go into more about specific design decisions in a minute. But we're also finding out that bad design decisions produce bad outcomes. So, I mean, this is kind of stacking the deck, right? Putting these two pictures next to one another. This is actually by Jan Gehl. So he's saying there are lots of opportunities. This creates what's called like a sociable space, a space where you have lots of opportunities for different kinds of interactions with people or for no interaction with people, if that's what you prefer. Well, how many opportunities and what kinds of different opportunities do you have here? You can walk by or you can walk inside. And so design affects not only the way we heal, as we've known since the 1970s, but how lonely we are, how sociable we are, how much we connect to each other, how much we develop a sense of community, and so on and so forth. Okay, I often say there's no such thing as a neutral space. If it's not helping you, then it's doing something bad. I can't really say it's hurting you, but I think it really is. Okay, so this cuts across so many different areas. I talked about healing, physical health and well-being. Take learning and children's cognitive development. This is Kieran Timberlake's Sidwell Friends School, and I just pulled that off the internet as like a not very appealing place to be, right? There was a study in the UK of learning progress. They took 750 pupils in classrooms in 34 different British schools and scored the classrooms on 6 design parameters, which included colors, the sense of choice, the complexity of the environments, the flexibility of the environments, light, and so on. Okay, and what these studies showed were, again, just kind of blow your mind kind of stuff. On average, the built environmental factors impacted students' learning and progress by 25%. 25%. Okay, take that and measure it in a different way. This was a 2-year study. From the beginning of 2 years to the end of 2 years, the students who were in the worst design classrooms and the students who were in the best design classrooms, the students who were in the worst design classrooms were almost a full year behind academically at the end of 2 years. The same curriculum, same teachers, same class, students, and so on. This is just a lot more impact than I think we're really aware of, than most people are aware of. Okay, so fine, you can say in a kind of Pollyannish way, all right, Sarah, design matters, but what is it about design that matters? I mean, you know, are you going to tell me I have to design red buildings or that I can't design red buildings? Well, no, I'm not going to say anything of the sort. But there are things that we can learn, and there are things that we can say. We've already learned about spatial navigation and wayfinding and how diagonal views are better than perpendicular views. Okay, that's one thing. To break it down in a somewhat simple and kind of a heuristic way, there's form and then there's surfaces. Let's just think about those things. Form. Now, form is something that in the design world is really important, right? Especially more and more in the last 30 years because we have all these images on the internet and you see Zaha Hadid and you see an aerial view and you think, wow, that's really cool, right? Well, okay, form is important because fancy forms help you create landmarks, which help you navigate through cities and so on. They give a sense of identity, to an overall identity to the place. This, by the way, is a daycare and community center in Port Elizabeth, South Africa, designed by a friend of mine, it's a wonderful architect, in one of the townships. Okay, so the rest of the township, wait a minute, the rest of the township looks like that. And so he didn't really do very much with the form. I mean, he made it a little bigger, and but it, formally, it is what it is, right? But he decided surfaces really matter. Surfaces, materials, and textures. Okay. The way we process form visually, our visual systems, basically what you're doing is you're assessing the overall geometry of forms, right? The way we process surfaces, materials, and textures goes through a different system in the brain. And that system, it just so happens, involves our emotions. So emotional salience in design comes through what are called surface-based cues. Now, that's too big of a generalization, because certainly I keep thinking of OMA's CCTV building, and I actually went there in Beijing and stood underneath that cantilever, and I can tell you it's scary, and that's an emotional moment. It's like, oh, I don't want to be here. Okay, so it's a bit of an overgeneralization, but it works. It does work. Emotional salience comes through surfaces and details. Okay, why? Going back to what we talked about before, the things that we now understand about cognition, intersensory and multimodal. You look at surfaces like this. These, by the way, are wine bottles. Everything in this was recycled. And you imagine the feel of the glass. You imagine picking up a bottle. The bottles are projecting out here. I'll show you that in a moment. The variation in surface catches light differently, and you imagine touching it in a way, and through kind of luring you in to imaginatively interact with these surfaces, they become more memorable. They become what I call sticky spaces. So you have a much greater possibility for placemaking if, as designers, you pay a lot of attention to scale, that's obvious, human scale, to touch, and to the way that people are actually going to appropriate these spaces, which is in this intersensory, multimodal way, and through association. So one of the things that's so cool about this is that here you have wine bottles being transformed into a daycare center, right? And kids actually, you can see this, they hang their backpacks on those bottles. It's really quite cool. Okay, so surfaces, that's one thing. Another thing that we learn from an aspect of environmental psychology that studies the way that we respond to nature is that what we know is that people like what's called patterned complexity. Okay, we like patterns because patterns help us make sense of things. They create discrete spaces. They say, okay, this is inside and the room is coherent in this way, and that's outside, it's someplace else, right? So you need patterns. But simple patterns people do not like. Not only don't they like it, it actually makes them stressed. We know this. People have measured cortisol levels and found out that walking through like kind of simply patterned, boring streetscapes rises cortisol levels. Okay, what they like is patterned complexity, which is just precisely what this architect did in this tiny little project without even really realizing it. It's a form of thinking in environmental design called biomimicry, but that makes architects a little nervous because, like, oh God, am I going to just like make representations of nature? No, we're talking about much more abstract ideas. The other thing that people like is changeability, cognitive stimulation. We are gluttons for information. And the more things change, the more we'll look. Okay? That's part of the reason that natural light is so important. It is because of our biological responses and so on to natural light. It's also because it's changing. And so we see that this space in the middle of the day looks different. I've been there. Looks different than it does in the late afternoon, and it looks different in the morning. And you can get some sense of where you are in the day while you're inside this space. So pattern complexity and changeability. Construction details. Now, nobody studied this, but Jenny, I'm going to give you an assignment. I'm hoping that people will. Construction details, of course, are really good ways of giving people a sense of scale, right? This architect used old skateboards as runners for these sliding panel windows and doors. So there's kind of association there. Okay, but also the construction details on this, which are so simple, you can see just a couple of nails hung up in a string. Again, because our sensory perceptions work with our motor systems, is that you imaginatively reenact how something is constructed when you're looking at construction details that are made transparent and obvious. This is something that Lou Kahn, actually, on whom I wrote my first book, talked a lot about. So I'm just giving you some really specific design elements that people can pay attention to based on this information. Okay, so if going back to information streams, if we're to combine what we're learning from environmental psychology and what we're learning from these studies in cognition, what we see is that the design of the built environment plays a huge role not only in health and well-being, in cognitive development, in place attachment, in social engagement, and so on and so forth. Now, this is another one of my favorite studies. They took mice and they put them in two different kinds of cages. One they called an impoverished environment, no little runny wheel, no things to climb on, and so on and so forth, just, water, food, the basics. And then they put the same kind of mice genetically in what they called enriched environments. And they just let them do their thing for a few weeks, and then they studied their brains. And lo and behold, rats, which, by the way, the structure of rat brains is very similar to humans, so it's very useful. The rat brains for the rats that had been in what are called enriched environments, had more dendrites, more synaptic connections. They literally grew better brains from being in enriched environments. And so what I'm advocating is that we reconceptualize design in this kind of large-scale way and say, how are we creating enriching environments? How can we create more enriching environments and better environments for people to grow better brains and have better lives, basically? Okay. So the large-scale implications of this are pretty big. It has implications for architectural pedagogy, the way design is taught. It has implications for the way society more generally places value or doesn't place value on the built environment. I mean, currently, even in design schools, to some extent, but certainly among the general public, what we have is a schism between architecture on the one hand and building on the other. And we all know that's architecture and that's building, right? And building doesn't really matter, but as I said, there is no such thing as a neutral environment. And in design matters in that little daycare center in the township in Port Elizabeth as much as it does in a museum, in a library, whatever. So forget architecture versus fabric. It's all architecture. Okay. And here, I'm just ending with slides I really like a lot. If we think about it in this way, we can sort of begin to reimagine All sorts of spaces. I mean, talk about pattern complexity. What an incredible example. This is Scottish National Parliament. This is civic buildings, workspaces, office spaces. This is the, you have a little desk over here, and then you have this ingle nook. Now, as it turns out, the people who use these office spaces over here don't actually use these ingle nooks very much because they don't have time to sit and read, right? They're busy like doing their stuff. But it creates a sense of warmth and domesticity, and it just completely transforms this workplace into something that's much more appealing for the people who are using it. Don't ask me how over budget that building was. Okay, light, daylight, artificial light. You can simulate daylight with artificial light. Color is something that I think a lot of design schools are just not all that focused on training students how to use color, which is hugely important, particularly for our emotional reactions to things. Again, back to surface-based cues. Okay, I'm going to skip through this. Well, I'll just show you. This is a little country church in Arkansas by Marlon Blackwell Architects. Again, tiny building. It was a 3-car garage. Okay, and the congregation bought it, and basically, what did Blackwell do? I mean, he stripped it. He put corrugated metal around the entire thing. He made it look like it was going to float, like it floats, by putting black stones around this thing. It's super simple. These people had almost no money for design. Put windows in unusual places so that you're constantly looking at the sky. Used color in these really powerful ways. That's just paint, folks. And what you have is design in, like, I can't even tell you how much this thing on the left costs because it costs nothing. Same with this thing on the right. You have design that's really changing people's lives every day. So that's my plea. Thank you.
Maybe just say who you are, what discipline you're from. Questions, Sarah? Yes,
Well, I have a question about color because it's such a controversial topic. I mean, on the one end, people say it's totally cultural through associations. On the other end, that there are psychological states that are produced by different colors.
Yep.
And I'm wondering where you stand on this.
Okay, well, I'm going to answer that kind of a long way around, which is that I come from architectural history and theory. And when I was doing my doctorate and in my early years of teaching, profoundly influenced by post-structuralism, social construction of reality. Everything was relative. You couldn't make these kinds of generalized points about anything, right? And after about 15 years of doing that, I thought, okay, so there's cultural variation. There's a lot of things about living in the 18th century that I couldn't tell you how that was. But there's a lot of things about people that are the same, right? We all have hands in kind of proportion to where we stand on the ground in sort of the same way. We all look forward, as I said. Our visual systems look the same. And so I'm not saying that you can generalize completely. But, for example, red is an obvious thing. We know infants love red, right? They look at it. That's cross-cultural. We also know that red environments, like red environments, raise people's stress levels. Okay? That's cross-cultural. So just because there's variation doesn't mean that you can't say, for example, that red is the color of blood and green is the color of leaves, and that means something to people more generally in ways that you can use in design.
I agree with you.
Good.
question.
Yeah.
I'm Andrew. I'm in the planning department. So I have a question about some of the kind of it sounds like, you also think about structures and things like that. So one of the most interesting things that I've read recently kind of in this area is that power dynamics do come into play to some degree, and so that you can't respond to an environment, or you're more likely to be able to respond to it if you have some kind of control over that environment
Yeah.
as well. So I don't know if, for example, some of the examples you're showing, if that's built into the idea in some way. I mean, looking at the image that's right behind you right now. Have you seen evidence of this? Have you seen, in the built environment in particular, of how we can create spaces and that in itself is enriching?
Oh, yeah.
But I mean, but within
Yeah,
within this
sure. I mean, look, take this daycare center, which is a project I just love, right? I mean, it's a little project, but here are people who live in these shacks. There's no running water there. They are pirating electricity. There's no garbage collection. The nearest school is 5 miles away. There's no health care anywhere. You have to walk 10 miles to get health care, right? But a kid can walk into this space and see a bunch of things. One, someone cared enough to put design into this to make it an orderly place. 2, scale. They thought about where I was going to put my backpack. 3, a sense of playfulness. All of these, it's not only a sense of connection, but it is a kind of, there are opportunities for people to appropriate those spaces. And they can be really small, and they can be much bigger, too. So I think there is vast opportunity for this. One of the underlying, the subtext, maybe not so sub, in my lecture is that design among the general public is seen as kind of an add-on or a luxury. It's something rich people get, right? And you see, this research shows you how impoverishing that is for people in all sorts of different ways. Okay. Anybody else? Yeah.
I'm interested about say in the 70s and 80s, there was this postmodern historicism which was talking so much about the importance of a sense of place and familiarity, and wondering how important, in your research or your analysis of the research, how important is familiarity? In other words, and that goes to color, for example, cultural preference for certain colors or textures or building forms as opposed to the new. Because we're so impacted by the new all the time, and I'm an appreciator of contemporary architecture and design, but we're also impacted by the new technologically,
Yeah.
culturally, all the time. And where in the spectrum of feelings is the familiar? In other words, a familiar
Yeah.
form. So it's an interesting.
It is. It's a great question. It's something that I've thought about a lot, actually, because, I mean, let's take the design of Levittown. If you grew up there, that's what's familiar, right? And so if you're looking for a home, you might well look for a home in a place that kind of looks like Levittown. Now, that doesn't mean that that's an enriching environment. So familiarity can be good. It's necessary in so much that if you create places that are totally unlike anything people know, they're going to shut down, right? But it's pretty hard to do that because you have to have doorknobs, and I mean, there are things about the human body that people need from places that make that hard to do. But people, and this is something that comes from behavioral economics, actually, people can, and they do all the time, prefer things that are worse for them. Okay? Which is part of the way that this information stream is very different from community planning, which some people have, when I started working on this material, said, oh my God, you're going back to community planning, please don't do this. I'm like, no, that's not it. We actually have information now. So that's my answer. Anybody else? Can you give me an example?
For example, okay, well, I guess trauma is kind of a powerful word. I'm treading lightly here, but for example, the events of Oxford here in Charlottesville,
Yeah.
thinking about how the space of Emancipation and Justice Park have shifted and changed
Yep.
Since then. I'm curious how, I guess I'm just kind of offering up this question of this topic, how the body and different bodies in space interact with that design now since the events of Oxford.
It's hard for me to answer that. It's a great question because people develop memories of spaces, right? And that becomes part of what they see when they go there and how they feel when they get there. I don't know what more to say than that. Architects have, or designers, city planners, whatever, they have a lot of control, they have a lot more power than I think they realized they did. This research is suggesting, but but people take over spaces in ways that they're never going to predict. So, sorry.
That's okay. But would you say that some spaces are more resilient after those events? No.
I'd have to think about it.
Okay.
Send me an email.
Okay,
It's an interesting question.
Thank you.
One more question then, perhaps from our students. Okay, well, maybe just finally 2 plugs and 2 thank yous. Sarah's book. Just 2 honest, quiet, plug it. And it's
Thank you.
core reading my environmental psychology class, so that's my second plug. Come to my class in fall. And several thank yous. We have to accord memory of Robert Plavnick. This lecture has kindly been sponsored by his memorial fund. I know very little about him, other than that he was a planner. Planners, if you want to elaborate.
Where's Tim?
He
was a lovely man.
Okay.
Thank you to you for coming, and can we also just raise our hands and applaud Sarah